All right, thank you for having me. Special thanks to Artifactory for hosting me and my artwork. I'm excited to go through uh, all sorts of elements of the work that I'm currently doing and what work I've done in the past that's led up to this. Um, I'll start with a little bit about myself. My name is Jason Snell, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist. Could also be called a technology-based artist. I use all sorts of different types of technology, and it's a usually a system of inputs and outputs. So I will gather information from motion or brain waves or sound or light or atmospheric conditions, and then transform that into different outputs, usually different forms of music or different forms of light and animation. Um, my background, I grew up here in Iowa. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I went to the public schools here. So if you know Cedar Rapids, Hoover, Taft, Jefferson, and then I actually dropped out of high school early. I dropped out halfway through my junior year from bowling. There were some bullies in school, and they had targeted me, and I thought, you know, I, I'm not here to get harassed. I'm here to get an education. And so I dropped out halfway through my junior year, and um, it was a Thursday, and Friday morning I was signing up for classes at Kirkwood, which is the community college here. And on Tuesday I started college, so my transition from high school to college was very fast. While I still was in high school, I was focusing on illustration classes. I've illustrated all my life. Enjoyed drawing comic books, just mimicking the different artists that I saw in the comic books I liked, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Avengers. A lot of the comic books, which are now Marvel movies, those were those stories, and the artists who illustrated those stories were very inspirational to me growing up. Um, Also in high school, I got involved with a really exceptional video program. And at that time at Jefferson, there was a English humanities teacher and then a football coach, and they teamed together to create this video program where they taught both the creative aspect of developing stories, acting, uh, coming together with creative ideas, and then the technical expertise of um, editing. At the time it was VHS. It was a system called a video toaster. It was a Mega computer, so you'd have two VHS decks, and then it had sources, so you could crossfade between them, and then a destination deck. And um, beyond the school projects, I made several art films in high school before I dropped out, and that was my first introduction to CSPS, which is a art hall here in Cedar Rapids. And at the time, they had a program called, I believe it was called Out of Bounds, and it was a vaudeville style. All sorts of different types of medium could be presented. So you'd have, I remember seeing like dancers and singers, and then I was able to show my video work. So that was some of my first experience of showing my work as an artist outside of a scholastic setting. After I left high school, I went to Kirkwood. I continued to take some art classes there, video classes. I got my associates pretty quickly in a year and a half, and then I transferred down to the University of Iowa. I took more film classes there and really centered in on a few things. So at the time, the art school there, it was 19, I was there from 95 to 98 to get my bachelor's. Um, the art school didn't teach computers yet. And so, if I wanted to learn different types of software, the way to do that was through the journalism school. So, technically, I'm a journalism major from the University of Iowa, with the secondary focus being in the art department. And I focused in on particularly graphic design. and learning how to do design both by hand and with software. I was also an illustrator for the Daily Iowan, and um, that's what's great is the last few years I've had a number of interviews from that student newspaper. So it's been particularly heartwarming to reconnect with that paper and share with them, the great experiences I've had as an artist. Um, Other experiences at the university was around that time when I turned 19. It was April, and that is when I got my first drum machine. So I hadn't experienced really much musical. I wasn't in a choir. I'm not a singer, and so kind of the traditional ways of expressing myself musically in school up until that point, I thought maybe I just wasn't a musician. I just music wasn't my thing. The issue was is I just didn't have the right instrument, and traditional band instruments didn't interest me. Neither did singing, which was the most common way of um, of expressing myself musically. But when I found a drum machine, and a drum machine, I will show you what one looks like in case this is. There are many drum machines, all from different manufacturers, but this is an Electron drum machine, and essentially has pads where you can play, drum kits on it, and different knobs to tweak those drums and alter those shapes and create rhythms. And when I found that, I just fell in love. I love making beat loops. I love making rhythms. I love making all sorts of style of music. And initially, I started out just experimenting. So I made very experimental drum machine loops, and got into all sorts of different types of electronic music, techno, something called breakcore, which is a mix of drum and bass and hardcore. And the first clip I'll show is it's a more recent performance. It was a breakbeat industrial. I mean, the genres, there's so many different genres that it can be hard to define them exactly, but this was a industrial breakbeat show in Prague, over in Czech Republic, and I'm performing with someone, which is a little unusual. Usually, in my techno experience, I perform alone and produce alone, but this is a short clip of a performance in Prague, so I'll start with that. Okay, so that's a little snippet of the type of industrial music that I make, and that's what I got into pretty quickly. So throughout college, while I was in school studying graphic design, on the weekends and nights, I was making drum loops. Working with drum machines, and then later synthesizers, samplers, sequencers, all sorts of both hardware and then later on the computer as well. So just making electronic music in all these different ways with whatever instruments I could find. I will show you some other instruments. I know it can be interesting to see some of the different tools that are used in electronic music. So this is going to look very similar to the drum machine that I showed you earlier, but it's actually a little keyboard. So these are the white keys and these are the black keys. And these knobs can change the instruments. This is a 4-voice digital synthesizer. And effects pedals. And so this is a reverb pedal, so it makes a sound particularly large, particularly expansive. Another synthesizer. So the keyboard on this one is over here. So we've got the white keys and the black keys, and then you can manually program in notes. And each of these have a sequencer that loops around. Um, that is something that is common with electronic music, is that it is loop based. You pick a tempo, it's 4/4, and it, loops in a sequence and add sounds, take away sounds, but it's very loop based. And that is something, as I've gotten into my work the last several years, is moving away from the built-in sequencers inside of the machines and then having music sequenced rather with body information. So information from the heart or information from the mind, information from kinetics like bodily movement, like of a dancer or breath. So there's different ways to create music from the human body rather than from these machines. However, these machines are where I started. Um, so I finished school and moved to San Francisco for a while, then Minneapolis. And Minneapolis, I took more coursework in at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and I was studying. At the time, it was the program was called Director, and it made Shockwave files. This is really old school at this point. So it was how to make CD-ROMs, and so I was learning how to incorporate graphic design with a little bit of computer programming, and with some animation, video, interactivity, and making CD-ROMs. Very quickly, this was like 99, 2000, very quickly that transitioned to Flash. And Flash was, that little thing that pops up in your browser and always bugs you to update your Flash player. And it died off a few years ago, 5 years ago, maybe longer. So for about a good 10, 15 years, 12 years, I programmed exclusively in Flash. And so I made animations, I made websites, applications for different websites. They're often called editorials in the advertising world. Also include digital ads, websites for documentaries. I ended up, taking some coursework in Minneapolis, learning that, and I moved to New York in 2000. I was in New York from 2000 to 2009, mostly working for large corporate media companies. And so I started initially with a little web shop that was in downtown New York. It shut down after 9/11, so I was out in New York for 9/11. And I began to do freelance work at that point, and just very, very lucky, very fortunate. My first freelance client was HBO. And so I made a Flash website for their 9/11 documentary, and also another one called On-Chain Memories. And it was about the WPA slave narratives. And it was creating a online multimedia augment, like a additional information. So you'd watch the documentary, then you could go to the website and get more information about the different people that were featured in the documentary. Then worked for AOL Music for a few years, building music-oriented technology sites. And then for many, many years, I worked for Condé Nast, and that name is not necessarily a household name, but their magazines are. So they are a publisher, and they publish Vogue, Wired, GQ, just dozens of magazines. And so my work was doing editorials or advertisements for the different magazines, but online and using Flash and then later JavaScript. So throughout that time, essentially, I became a very good computer programmer because I was initially using tools that were more artist-based, such as timelines, animation with timelines on the computer on Flash. And then over time, learning how to do all those animations and all that construction of digital objects and digital projects such as apps or websites, doing it all with code. So not using the timeline anymore, but just learning how to program, how to create projects. And it's called object-oriented programming. And it's, creating reusable objects and constructing systems with it. A website is a type of system. And that's the knowledge that I've been able to carry into the art projects that I work on now, is just those years and years just tens of thousands of hours of doing computer programming that allows me to create the technology-based art that I do now. In parallel, that whole time, I was making techno, touring, releasing albums, and mostly under my first moniker was Bombardier. The Bombardier project, so the aesthetic was very military, and those were just things I was drawn to, particularly in my late teens and early 20s. Things like Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, those films. And in retrospect, and art is often this way, kind of reflecting on what America was post-Vietnam. I was just really drawn to those types of films and images, and then the music itself is very bombastic. It sounds like explosions. It sounds like war. It's a very heavy music. Then I worked on Bombardier material for many, many years, and have continued to release material, not as actively now, but I released, something will come out this year. So it's something I will cycle through, and that's something pretty common with art is that I go from medium to medium, and that helps me from getting too burned out on one particular medium. Next project that I gravitated towards was working with a singer. I moved out to Berkeley, California, so I left New York in 2009. I moved to California. I was bouncing between Berkeley and Los Angeles, and I started working with a vocalist in Berkeley, and her birthday was 5th of July, and that became the name of the band. And we wanted to really explore its kind of a dark, somewhat occult vibe. We used a lot of reverse vocals, kind of heavy dark synths, and also there was a costuming. So this next clip is just a little clip of a concert we did in Los Angeles, and it's multiple camera, and so you'll see different snapshots and layers. But it has a very distinct. We're developing its own world, so it had a very distinct vibe, and so I'll show you that, and you'll get a sense of the music and the aesthetic. I have a mask on, like a theater mask on, and I'm playing a guitar with a bow while also organizing and playing beats off of my computer. And then the vocalist, her name's Jessica Shane. She's the singer, and then we've got this whole host of people in theater masks on the stage. So it was a very theatrical, just kind of a mix between David Lynch and Sleep No More, which is a theater production in New York. I want to mix those vibes into this very distinct world. So. Next, I'll show you a short film that I made that is of that similar world. After creating that video, I actually returned to motion work. I met a dancer who was based in Berlin. I was at a wedding in Berkeley, and she was one of the guests. And we were talking about our different work, and she had talked about she has done dance performances with motion sensors where her motion controlled the lights, but she wished that her motion could control the sound. I instantly knew. I was like, oh, that's something I could do. And she just lit up, and we began to work together. So I started designing the system while I was here in the States. I did a lot of the work actually at the Cedar Rapids Public Library. But finally, I settled in on these really cool wristbands. And so these are motion sensor wristbands, and they can detect rotation and then also movement and direction. So I worked with her, and this is a clip. This was from our very first motion sensor test. And so in the foreground, you'll be seeing my drum machine. Here it is again. You'll see this guy in the foreground, and you'll see her motion in the background lighting up these different pads over here. And each of those is a sound. So she is able to compose sound with her dance. And that was the beginning of this kinetic work. After I worked with that Berlin-based dancer, I developed the next performance, and it was in Los Angeles. It was with at the Jason Voss Gallery in downtown LA. It was with a collective, an art collective called Futura. So I was still using these same motion sensors, and I was working with a really phenomenal dancer named Ty Wells. And the one in LA, when I worked with Ty, is he wanted this idea of very mechanical sounds, so starting with very human sounds like different chest thumps and throat sounds and very human sounds, and then slowly morph that into machine sounds. And his actual dance felt like he was being overcome by a machine. And so it was interesting to use technology in a way that felt like this technology was overcoming him. So I'll show you a short clip of the performance in Los Angeles. From the kinetic movement, before I get into the EEG work, which was the next step in the progression, I'm going to take a quick detour. And this was a public art piece I did in Iowa City in 2019. And my name is Jason Snell. I'm a multimedia artist, and I installed this piece, Mutable Sequencing. The idea behind it was exploring how memories change over time, and that when an event happens in our life, it encodes into our memory a particular sequence of data. Each time a memory is recalled, it mutates a little bit, it transforms a little bit. I took the concept of memory and applied it to this public art installation. There are motion sensors through the 5 stories of the stairwell, so that as people move through, the musical score is being written and recorded into this system, and then becoming a full musical composition. Over the course of several weeks, people's movement in different variations, like if they come in on the 3rd floor or 5th floor or 1st floor, that will mutate the notes of the original composition, and that's the equivalent of remembering a memory. People's movement will mutate all the different pieces of the musical score. So by the end of the exhibit, there will be the original composition and then the one that's been changed by people's movement over time. coming out of the kinetic work, the next step was starting to work with an EEG. And the EEG headband, so it's this headband that goes over the forehead and reads the electricity from the forehead, and then has two sensors on the back, and it reads the electrical activity coming off of my brain. And I've used this headband to compose music. So I take my thoughts and convert them into notes, into in different types of MIDI, which can control the frequency, the pitch, the pulse width, the frequency, the envelopes, the attack and the release, all sorts of attributes of the sound. And so I'm able to form both sound and compose notes, with my thoughts. This was the very initial test. This actually began in early 2018. It was based on a dream I had. And the dream was about making music from information inside the body. And this was a way to, it felt like magic. It was thinking thoughts in this initial test. It was, can I, change my delta waves, which was a very controllable wave in the brain with this particular EEG. Can I use the ups and downs of that to insert notes into a composition? And so that's what's happening in this clip. Once I got past the prototype phase, I had it took about a year to build into something where I could perform for longer. My first performance was January of 2019 over in Des Moines with Yellow Door Gallery, and it was at Art Terrarium. And the space there, the performance space, is quite small, and I was relieved about that. I didn't want a ton of people coming, because the thing about this project is about vulnerability. If I'm performing just with like a machine and, I just, hit, the play button and then turn knobs, there's a defense there. There's like this armor, this like physical armor between like, okay, the audience is hearing the machine and I'm behind the machine. With the EEG, you're hearing my brain. So if I'm nervous, if I'm excited, if I'm distracted, if I'm tired, all of that comes out in the music. And so it's this very vulnerable like snapshot of who I am in this moment. So when I was doing that very first performance in Des Moines, it was like, okay, if 20 people show, 30 people, I didn't want to be super nervous for the very first performance, because I wanted to make sure everything worked. And so it got close to showtime and it filled up, and then it kept filling up, and then people were lined out outside the doors. So it ended up being about 110 people trying to squeeze into that performance. And I thought, all right, this is a very interesting project. People are very interested in this concept, and dive in the deep end and, make it work. So this is some footage from that initial performance. The lines you see kind of moving up and down to me, those are the brainwave levels. I'm projecting them onto my torso. So. Ended up being a very popular project, and I toured a lot in 2019 and then into the beginning of 2020. So I'm going to show you just a series of clips from around the world. Some of them are quite local. One is a little snippet of the performance at Iowa City Public Library that was sponsored by the Public Arts Commission, the Iowa City Public Arts Commission. Shows from Los Angeles. There'll be a big projection dome underneath me. That was from Slam Dance, which is an offshoot from the Slam Dance Film Festival. It's called Slam Dance, DIG, Design, Interactive, and Gaming. There's footage from a sound festival in Berlin called Euphonia, and St. Ambrose over in Davenport from CSPS in Cedar Rapids. And then the last footage from a show in Winnipeg, and that was like March 12th of 2020. And so that was my last show, like during the pandemic. And then I'll put a little clip of I was on the Winnipeg Morning News, and so it's just really a funny environment to be making brain music.
A two-day event kicking off today in Winnipeg combines technology and the traditional arts. And we have Jason Snell, one of the presenters. And how do you describe to people what you do? Because it is incredibly interesting and very cool.
Well, I've hacked into this EEG headband, which will read the electrical activity of my brain, and it goes Bluetooth into an iPhone app I made, which then converts it into musical information, and then that will play sound kit off the computer. So it's essentially brain waves to MIDI, which is electronic music language, into actual sound, and so I'm able to compose entirely with my brain.
On an app that you made yourself?
Correct.
Oh my gosh, okay, we need to see this. Yeah, we need to see this in action, please.
All right.
This is so cool.
It takes a few seconds to get booted up, but let's get started.
Can we talk to you while you do this, or no? You need your brain waves.
A little bit, and that's one of the purposes of doing this project is that where I am, if I'm nervous, if I'm relaxed, if I'm focused, if I'm unfocused, that comes out in the music. So
I'm gonna let you focus.
There we go.
Okay, that is so interesting. We have to throw to commercial break, but before we do so, where can we go to learn more about you and all the cool stuff that you're doing?
This project is called Primary Assembly, so primaryassembly.com.
After that Winnipeg show, I was staying in New York at the time, and I flew back there. I had a cough. The friend I stayed with then got sick, and she tested positive for COVID, and so I realized I had picked up COVID, probably in Berlin. I was doing a tour in Europe. But yeah. Anyways, had COVID, really knocked me down quite a bit. I had a fairly mild case, but a very long case. I had a long haul COVID, so a lot of transitions happened. You know, I'm very, very grateful to the huge amount of COVID relief grants that were available for artists. That's literally what kept me going through 2020. You know, from Iowa Arts Council, from all sorts of national Foundation of Contemporary Arts. There's United States artists, so just a ton of help. You know, so I transitioned to doing shows online, which was very different. You know, it's something that's so. I mean, every performance is you know, interacting with the audience and feeling a connection to the audience. But it still worked, and so I'll show you just a couple of clips of some online shows I did, and it was an online show with CSPS. They invited me back for a digital online show, and then a few Iowa City performances. So one was with the UI Center of Advancement. We did an interview and then a show, and kind of spoke about the technology, and then Examine Life Conference, which I believe is with the med school at the University of Iowa. And also one that I teamed up with a team of artists in Europe that are focusing on privacy. And so it was, there was, our first performance was at Electric Dreams, which was a festival in UK. And it was examining how my brain made music when I was alone, and then being watched by two friends, you know, on Zoom, and then live at the festival with a bunch of strangers watching me. Last November, everyone was getting antsy, and they were looking at how to do shows outside, you know, through the fall. And I was contacted by a promoter in Des Moines again, and they were doing an art show that was a drive-in theater style. So I said, they knew about my work. They had seen it at the Des Moines show early in 2019. And so I was asked to come down and be the feature presentation of a performance that was live outside. It was November, it was a little cold, but it wasn't terrible. But to do an EEG sound performance outside at this drive-in theater, so everyone, it was easy to stay, socially distanced from everyone and do the show. Now, one of the things normally, as you've seen in these performances, I'm projecting my brainwaves onto the screens, and I thought about doing that to, have my brainwaves being projected on the drive-in theater screen. But it was pretty dark out, and I wasn't sure if the people in their cars would understand that there was actually a person sitting in the dark, and that the brainwaves weren't just, like a video. And so what I did instead was I had, instead of projecting the waves, directly onto the screen as I normally was, I went back to the original concept of that first show, and I projected the waves onto my body. And I condensed them. I really zoomed into the data, so it's a much thicker wave. And I wanted people to see that the waves were going up and down on a human form. And then what's projected on the screen then was me with the waves projected on my body. And it ended up kind of a happy accident where it became this really striking visual. So I'll show you the Des Moines clip, just a little bit of it so you can see that aesthetic. So coming out of that, the next time I did a digital show, I was so struck by how good those lines looked on my body. I thought it'd look all right, but I didn't realize like how sci-fi and futuristic and how much it gelled together this idea of electricity from my brain coming out into a visual and audio medium and then being projected back onto my body. So it really reinforced this combination between humanity and technology, in one form. So I refined it, and the next clip you'll see, it is an online performance, but I'm in a completely dark room, and it ended up being this very, very striking aesthetic. So it's at a really, in my opinion, a very striking place. So I'll show you some of this footage. It was from a show after the Des Moines show. It was for some promoters in Minneapolis in the techno world, and they wanted me to perform some techno, some of my techno with the EEG. And then what you're seeing is my brainwaves are being projected on my body, and the dominant color you see is the dominant wave. So blue is meditation, red is stimulation, white is focus, and purple is kind of a daydreamy mental state. So coming up for future projects, I'm continuing to do the EEG work, and then doing more public art. And the thing that's going to be kind of the most exciting thing for 2021 is there's an alley space in downtown Iowa City. It's between Lynn and Dubuque. So essentially, like across the street from Prairie Lights leads into an alley that heads over to Studio 13, which is a club. That whole alleyway, I'm working with again, the Iowa City Public Arts, Downtown District, a lighting designer from Des Moines, and then Slingshot Architecture is project managing the system, the whole project. So the lighting designer from Des Moines is going to create this array of lights above the alley. From they're installing new utility poles, and they've asked me to install motion sensors so the lights react to people as they come into the alley, very similar to the ramp project that I did. And then it'll also become a concert space. And so I'm programming the lights to be reactive to sound or MIDI. So you could play a keyboard and then the keys would light up in the sky. I'm working with a dancer again, where her movement with these motion sensor wristbands, her movement will create sound, but also light up the sky. As she's moving, she'll be able to control the color and animations above her in this alley. I'll also do an EEG presentation there, so I will be making music with my brain, but also controlling the colors and the animations of the lighting system above the alley. And that's something, I believe the utility poles are being replaced right now. The lighting designer will come in, and I'll show you, here's a mock-up of what the alley will look like, just a rendering from the lighting designer. But that's something that will be coming this summer. The system will be built, and then I'll be having a series of concerts, musical concerts, a dance performance, as a way to show off the capabilities of the system. And it's a permanent system. It's a public art system. So the intention is for other artists to be able to plug into the system and create their own shows with this advanced lighting system. So that's the big thing for 2021. And I'm looking forward to any questions you may have. So thank you again, Artifactory, for having me present my work and tell a little bit about myself and my background. It's always an honor to have people interested in the things that I produce. So thank you very much.